In a previous video, I put together what's called consumer and seller surplus. And what we saw in that video was that these surpluses are maximized at the equilibrium price, and this is an efficient outcome. We're making full use of our resources in the market. Now I'm going to tie taxes into that analysis of consumer surplus. So this type of analysis that we're doing right now, when we're beginning to look at the effects of a market intervention such as taxes on the well-being or the welfare of buyers and sellers, this is called welfare analysis. That's what we're here to do in this little video segment. So let me go ahead and put together again our market for it, whatever it is. And we're going to tax it. There's the equilibrium price, and at that price, in the free market, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. Now, to mix things up a little bit and to show things that we've already looked at in a different way that will result in the same outcome, I'm going to go ahead and tax the consumers a bit. In the past, we taxed the sellers a bit. And when we taxed the sellers a bit, we saw that that resulted in a higher price paid by the consumers. So let's go ahead and tax the consumers, and maybe we can do something where the sellers of it will bear all of the burden of the tax. You know what I mean? Like, if we taxed the sellers before and the consumers ended up paying part of it, let's go ahead and tax the consumers and see what happens if we do that. Well, as a consumer of it, how does that make you feel? Maybe like, does it decrease your demand for it? The idea that you're going to have to pay more for it, one part to the seller, one part to the government, kind of decreases demand, right? So let's go ahead and decrease demand for it because we're going to tax it. So there's our decrease in demand for it. Darken that line because it's not probably that visible, okay? So there's our decrease in demand for it. Now we have a new equilibrium quantity here. So the market shrunk just like it did when we taxed the sellers. We saw that same thing happen. Now we have a new equilibrium price here, and let's think about what that means. To make this quantity right here, according to the supply curve, the sellers, there aren't as many, or they won't make as much, but to do so, they don't require as high of a price. So then this becomes the price received. But along our demand curve, our underlying true demand curve that really represents what the consumers are willing and able to do before the tax, for that quantity, they're willing and able to pay this much. So this becomes the price paid. And that got a little crazy there, but there we go. That's the price paid. And so now we have the same outcome. The price paid has risen, and the price received has fallen. And one thing I know that's a little bit confusing is, well, there are two demand curves. Why would you go to the old demand curve? Because the consumers were willing and able to spend this price for this much in the old, before the changes happened. Now, to get that much, they would be willing to spend exactly the difference of the tax to do it. Because, in other words, if I'm willing to spend $4 for something, and the government says, you're going to have to pay us 50 cents for it. Well, now I'm really willing to spend $3.50 plus 50 cents, $4 for it. Because I was willing to spend $4 for it. So what happens when you tax something on the consumer side, on the demand side, it decreases demand vertically by exactly the height of the tax. If these lines are parallel lines, notice this height is the same over here, and that's why this gap, just like before, is the tax. So a key takeaway of this chapter is that it doesn't matter whether you tax the consumers or you tax the sellers. The burden gets shared, generally shared across these. Now in a later video, we're going to see how that might be out of balance. It may not be shared equally across the consumers and the sellers. And that's really exciting stuff. But we have other things that are also exciting to do before we can get to that. we're going to go back to that welfare analysis. We're going to tie that into this market. Remember, the welfare analysis was the analysis of how the tax was going to affect the consumer and the seller surplus. Well, in the old model that I had drawn, I'll go ahead and just draw it again. I'll squeeze it in over here. Whoops. Let me just take that out of space. This was all consumer surplus, cha-ching. This is all seller surplus. Well, let's see how this compares over here. Let's first start with what the government gets out of this. Remember, governments only have two ways to fund their operations: taxes or debt, which is future tax obligation with interest. So we need to have these taxes in order to fund government services. So the government gets something. Can we tell what the government gets? Well, the government is charging some amount per item sold. Here's the amount. There's the per item sold. So government revenue is equal to the tax times the amount that actually gets sold. So that is a rectangle right here. That's a base and that's a height. So this rectangle is actually government revenue. But remember, this up here, let's just call this A, was consumer surplus. This whole triangle, I left it like that for a reason. Is it the same over here as it used to be? No. Part of the government's revenue came from the consumer. It was taken, the cha-ching was taken from the consumer and given to the government in form of revenue. And the A here only covers the area down to the equilibrium price. So that part right there is taken from the consumer and transferred to the government. So let's call this part B right here. And there is that. That's the top portion of this rectangle drawn in there. In this picture, down here, let's call it F, this whole triangle is and was seller surplus. But now the government has taken some seller surplus in the lower portion of this rectangle over here. So if I just draw this the same as I have it over there, I'll label this D. And so now government revenue, these are not perfect drawings, but this rectangle and this rectangle are meant to be the same rectangle. Government revenue is also equal to, let me do it this way, B plus D. That's this rectangle represented by this rectangle. I'm just trying to go back to a model with less lines on it to really show you the parts for the welfare analysis. A plus F are the remaining surplus. Right? That's what's still there after the tax. How about here? This was the little bit of cha-ching that was being experienced by the consumers that they wouldn't have posted on Instagram. You know, they were actually willing to spend $3.25 for a cup of coffee, but they could get it for $3. Now, the price paid is more like $4.50. They're not going to buy it anymore at all. They're out. That's above their threshold price. So this part is lost from consumer surplus. But nobody's benefiting from that. It's just gone. And we'll call that C. How about down here? These are sellers who were actually willing to sell it for a few cents less than the equilibrium price, but they used to be able to get the equilibrium price, and now the price received, maybe it would be beneficial if I wrote those over there, I don't know, is somewhere lower than their threshold price. So this is the price paid. This is the price received. All I'm doing is transferring this over there. So they're out. So down here, this is seller surplus that is gone, and I'll call this E. So now we have C plus E meaning something. Those were surpluses that were in the market that are gone from the market. The government gets the rectangle. That's necessary to have goods and services from the government. But these are gone, and there are no government services coming from that. They are just gone. They are where parties are made worse off without making everyone better off. The government revenue is making the government better off. This is just gone from the market because these are sellers and consumers who are no longer participating. And so that's why these equal dead weight loss. And that is an inefficiency. Oops, I'm out of space, aren't I? That is an inefficiency of taxes. So this is why taxes are not efficient, is because we reduce the total consumer or seller surplus in the market by having taxes. Going back to the very beginning, the social problem of mankind is balancing social justice, economic efficiency, and individual liberty. Here we're losing efficiency, but what are the government services for? Very often they are about social justice. So we're making a trade-off between efficiency and equality or equity, the social justice piece. And that's what it looks like.